So I'm glad to have all of you joining us on this interesting topic. So my name is Doug Plata. I'm a physician trained in family and preventive medicine, and I work in urgent care and occupational medicine. And I'm also the president and founder of the Space Development Network. This is a free-to-join organization of space advocates of all sorts of different levels, and we organize ourselves into working groups working together on projects to advance the plan for sustainable space development. If you'd like to check out our website, it's very extensive. It takes about 8 hours to read it all. It's at developspace.info. On practically any topic is covered there in regards to space development and settlement. And if you would like to be a part of the network, feel free to join us and we can plug you into the working group of your interest. So my topic today is countries on Mars, an inevitable outcome. So let's jump right into it. Let me just give you a quick overview. I'm going to describe how I think the sequence is going to happen from base all the way through to actual countries, politically independent countries. And then I'm going to discuss the relevant factors and why it is that I think it's probable that there will be multiple independent countries on Mars. And then I'm going to discuss, which is sort of the elephant in the room, but I think it's sort of out in the open, and that is if you have independent countries, are they going to cooperate together or are they going to conflict? And I'm going to suggest the Northwest Ordinance as a model of how we can prevent conflict, yet enable these countries that want to emerge. I am going to go ahead and discuss countries both on the Moon and Mars. Moon is a little bit easier to explain for some specific reasons, but we will end on Mars. And I don't have a real detailed description of what countries I think are going to be or where they're going to be, but I'll provide some sort of a framework for how that could be figured out. Okay, so it's an interesting topic. So from base to countries, so what I'm proposing here is on Mars, there's first going to be a central international base, okay? But the base is going to grow, especially have a starship, if we have a fleet of 1,000 starships delivering 100 people per starship, then that international base is going to grow and grow, and you're going to have different people groups that are going to start spreading from the international base, making little colonies or settlements that are sort of people-specific people groups. And then as those grows, they will go hopefully to territories similar to the Northwest Ordinance. And then as it grows to maybe 50,000 or so, then they will become politically independent countries, actually. So the relevant factors. So I want to propose that if we understand the relevant factors that will affect an outcome, that it will give us a fairly decent idea of what that outcome might be. In other words, the relevant factors are things that drive future outcomes. Yes, there could be black swan events or various things. Perhaps a particular charismatic leader might steer things in a different direction. But I'm going to explain the relevant factors that I think will drive towards independent countries on Mars. So here's the question. What are some of the relevant factors that might lead to the establishment of countries on Mars? This is the heart of this presentation. So the relevant factors is sort of inherent nationalism. Not everybody is a nationalist, but plenty of people are. So we have these two choices. On the left, I have the United Nations building as an example of sort of desire to coordinate or perhaps even a one world government, versus think about nationalism. Is our world heading towards more and more cooperation or people expressing themselves as nations? And I think nationalism is not going away. I think people love being who they are. Brazilians, when they play in the World Cup, soccer or football, international football, they are nationalistic. And and it's not a bad thing. You know, in that case, it's good. Now, I think another relevant factor is just this inherent desire over time for people to want to be politically independent. You know, think of the British Empire or the French Empire or the Dutch colonies or the Spanish Empire. And what are what are those empires now? They're just a whole bunch of independent countries, right? And I think that is the trend. That is the direction that people will want to go. And I'm proposing that on Mars, with time, Martians are going to want to run their own show and not forever be run from the world, from Earth. Okay. Wealth, and this is people groups by GDP to show. And if you figure that millionaires, there's 86 million millionaires in the world, and you think about who can afford to go, who can purchase that ticket to go, you can, perhaps it correlates with GDP. And so we can imagine that the English-speaking countries could make up the largest single group. China, with its wealth, I mean, it's #2 or arguably #1 GDP right now, or purchasing power. So definitely there's a lot of Chinese that would be able to afford to go. And then you have like all of the European Union, approximately the same sort of size. So we can get a sense of what people would be settlers, both government settlers or national astronauts left behind, as well as private settlers who pay their own way to go. So age, this is an interesting thing. So do you guys remember Elon Musk in his Guadalajara presentation? He addressed this issue, and I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten this, but I think it's really key to understanding how does settlement work economically. Okay, it's not discovery of some unobtainium and trade. No, what it is the intersection between who wants to go, and Mars Society can do something to try to generate interest in people wanting to go, and then those who can afford to go. And those who want to go and afford to go are the people that will actually be paying the tickets. Those who don't want to go, doesn't matter how much money they have, they're not going to buy the ticket. For those who want to go, but they don't have the money to do it, they probably will not be able to go. And so it's that intersection. Now, who are these people who want to go and who can afford to go? Let's start with the afford to go. It's basically this. It's people who go are people who will have saved up enough money. With, you know, in their life, they got into some sort of career, and over time, over 2 or 3 decades, they saved up enough money to where they can afford to go. Okay. Also, people, you know, if you are somehow made it wealthy in your 20s and 30s, and you can afford to pay, but you have children in school and they've got friends, and you know, probably it's just not the right time to take the family and ship them to Mars. Okay. And then occupational responsibility is another thing. Yes, you could be an inventor, but not everybody's an inventor. So typically people will finish their career and then they have a lot more free time in their retirement. So who does this describe? People who have enough money, people who are freed from childhood responsibilities, and people who are freed from occupational responsibilities. The answer ought to be obvious, and this is older people, retirees. Not people in nursing homes with you know, trying to hobble around. No, these are like 55 plus active seniors. They've still got a lot of life in them. These are the ones who I think will be overrepresented amongst settlers. Okay, so if you think back at the sort of people that here's another relevant factor, and that is people want to or even need to live with other people like themselves. Okay, the major one is language. If you are retiree, if you're older and you have more difficulty learning a new language, then you'll probably be wanting to live in the Japanese part of the international base. And so people will naturally migrate by language. They'll naturally migrate to that part of the base that has people like them. And then as those groups are living together, they develop their own identity, even within the international base. And I'm proposing that those groups will be the ones who will say, hey, let's go ahead and establish a little separate settlement that will be the Arab settlement or whatnot. So languages would be a major driving factor. Nationalities, I think people who have the same language, but they live in different countries, they are going to feel closer to people who are of their own nationality, their own background, their own history. And then religion, for example, I think Mormons, I think might like to start their own settlement. I think that Hindus and certainly Muslims, probably of the two major types of Muslims. And then also, interestingly, political philosophies. It could be that people will, especially libertarians, will say, we want a chance to demonstrate to humanity what a libertarian-based government would be like. And how do they get this chance? They start up some sort of libertarian colony fund, and Libertarians on Earth, they donate $20 per month or something like that. And this buys tickets for young, committed libertarians to go settle in a certain part of the planet and start living the libertarian lifestyle, as an example. Okay? And so, you know, here are some different people groups that I sort of came up with that I imagine could be the basis for people groups that will go and start to establish their own separate political entities on Mars. An obvious thing is you have to have enough people to be able to begin to even consider moving away from the international base and starting the process towards political independence. So I don't know what the numbers are that where people would start to begin to go to a different form of governance model. But let me just say, if you have 300 Portuguese speakers, then those people might feel like they're a large enough group. If the technology, the habitat and life supports and ISRU is advanced to a high enough level, then they could say, we've got enough people, let's go ahead and start our own Portuguese settlements. Perhaps still close to the international base, but starting their own identity. I'm going to suggest that it would be good, and this is my policy recommendation, and that is that we have an interim phase in which there's areas of Mars that are designated as territories. When would people move from near the international Martian base to a territory, which is clearly a step towards becoming their own country? I don't know, but I'm suggesting somewhere around 5,000 people. If the settlement gets that large, perhaps it's time to do the migration month. And people are, you know, that you first set up some habitats and some infrastructure in the area, and then you move all the people pretty much at once. And then any more Portuguese speakers, for example, when they come, they could either go to the international base or they could go to that Portuguese territory. And then at what point do they become a country? I would like to suggest that it maybe be around 50,000 people, and I'll show the Northwest Ordinance as an example of that. The timing of it is going to also depend on tech maturation, meaning habitat systems, life support, growing food, ISRU, producing your metal parts. The technology needs to get high enough to where you can feel comfortable establishing a separate little settlement and make sure it's functioning well before the people move out of the international base and all of the infrastructure that's built up there and go ahead and move to this new location. Okay, but the elephant in the room is if people start becoming separately, politically separate entities, there's a danger of conflict, but there's also the potential for cooperation. You know, we think about the Olympics, for example, how that is an example of nationalism, but it's not nationalism that leads to wars. It's nationalism in which people take pride. Yes, they're competing with other people groups, other countries, but you know, like this picture here, there's sportsmanship even between the nations in that competitive setting. And so this is an example of nationalism, but in a cooperative sort of setting. But on the flip side, nationalism has most definitely led to conflict. I think history is absolutely filled with this sort of thing. I think that we should try to take action very early in the settlement of Mars to prevent this sort of thing from happening, okay? So how do we prevent conflict? In the United States after the Revolutionary War, there was, the United States beat the British, and as part of the agreement, the United States got the Northwest Territories, and you see it there in that brown goldish sort of area. It's around the Great Lakes, okay? So Congress had this property, and the question is, what are we going to do with it? So what they did is they drew lines for territories, and they said it was either 50 or 60,000 people. Once the population got to that level, then they could go ahead and vote their own state constitution. They could vote their own governor and whatnot, their own leaders, and they could go ahead and apply to Congress to become a state of the United States. And this is what happened, and those borders held. People who moved into the Indiana Territory knew that when it reached 50 or 60,000, they were going to become a state with whoever their neighbors were. And so I'm suggesting that early on, borders be drawn with anticipation that people groups are eventually going to want to become politically independent, not just of Earth, but also from the other countries on Mars. So let's go ahead and talk about lunar countries, because I think this is an example. I think the same thing is going to be happening on the Moon and Mars. And it's sort of easier to explain the details on the Moon, and I'll show you why. But imagine that you have here a surface, and you start with the initial habitat with very historic people, and they build up some infrastructure, and then you start delivering specialty habs to this international base, okay? And international countries, countries have far deeper pockets than do even their wealthiest citizens. For example, the United States government has more money each year than Elon Musk has been able to save up in his entire life, easily, you know, many times over. And so I think the most expensive tickets, the early tickets, are going to be purchased by countries first, and they're going to go ahead and send their astronaut heroes to do some exploration. I'm guessing that most of those people are going to remain behind in a growing international base, okay? But then if you have an international base, as it grows to a certain size, and as the people groups starting to become large enough and the technology is maturated, the habitat systems, for example, I'm proposing that there's going to be roads built, and there will be you know, the Portuguese group, they're going to start developing their infrastructure. They're going to implement the same sort of technology that was used in the international base. They'll set up their power systems, whatnot, but they will be connected by trade. You know, the international base is maybe going to be producing stuff that this little settlement is going to need. But now it's got a little foothold, and this is going to be the basis for a growing settlement that's specific for this people group, okay? Such as the Portuguese language base. On the Moon is different than Mars, obviously, and there's these peak of eternal lights, which are the most valuable places on the Moon. So if you take a look at the sunlit areas and the permanently shadowed areas where there's likely the resources of ice and organics, including carbon and nitrogen, that L-Cross found in 2009. So what you could do is you could draw around these sort of wealthy areas and say, well, let's go ahead and connect the areas with high sunlight with nearby areas with permanently shadowed craters, presumably increased amount of volatiles. And so between those, you can sort of imagine borders, and these are little colonies, sort of temporary places that are at the poles, that we could imagine perhaps people groups choosing to move to. Around Shackleton Crater, perhaps if you have those locations. This is just my imagination. It's not even a proposal, but this is sort of what the boundaries would be between the settlements. Okay. Now on Earth, we like to have natural borders. The red lines are rivers that divide states, okay? And like over here, you have the border between, sorry, this is fairly well known. The border between Spain and France is the Pyrenees, and that creates a natural border, this being a range of mountains. So people, when they develop borders, they sort of want to look at natural places. Well, we don't have rivers, and we do have some mountain chains, but what are the things that really stick out that you might be able to draw lines around? Well, it's those big craters. I mean, you can see them from Earth, okay? So first, the territories at the poles are very special, and I think there needs to be sort of a free trade agreement to make sure that territories and countries in other parts of the moon will have access. They don't have to pay a tariff to be able to get their life support. Very important, and important for preventing conflict as well. But then there are those areas of big craters. So imagine you just start drawing lines and you say, okay, you know, these are countries, and you might name them by some prominent crater within them. Perhaps, you know, this could be a basis for country borders. And again, I'm proposing that we want to draw these lines fairly early on, so that there's not conflict where people, two or three people groups are in one area and they start fighting each other over borders and resources. Okay, so lunar countries, but what about Martian countries? This is harder because you don't have that severe constraint of resources on Mars like you do on the moon. I mean, you got the atmosphere, the carbon, nitrogen everywhere around Mars. You have large areas that have water, not just the poles, but you know, at mid to upper latitudes. Well, I'm going to suggest that probably Starship is going to be the way that people are first going to be going to Mars. And so SpaceX actually, this is behind the black, SpaceX has actually requested some images of specific locations, which we believe is where they're looking at as possible landing sites. So here's one of the locations. For the fun of it, let's just imagine that they choose this crater. I have no idea that they will, but for the fun of it, let's just say. And then within a small area, you have this scenario, which I think you all have seen. Elon presented this. You know, in, let's say, 2026, the first people landing on Mars is probably a bit early. But actually, let's call this a cargo, which is, I think, quite reasonable. 2028 is perhaps more cargo, and habitats are being delivered, supplies, life support, etc. And then the initial group of people, probably not a lot of people. You don't want to risk too many people initially, but let's say 75. And then as the Starship fleet grows, the population on Mars begins to grow and grow. Here, let's say 2035, 10,000. Can we believe that? That seems unbelievable, and yet if you look at the number of starships and how many they would carry and how many flights they would have done by then, that is not unreasonable. And then, you know, from there on, you can imagine it just grows until, you know, you have 100,000 per year is SpaceX's goal. But now back there in 2035, where perhaps there's thousands of people, even at that point, think about those people groups. If you do the math, it turns out there'd be about 3,500 English speakers. China maybe have 2,000 people if they're not doing their own separate thing. The European Union would have about 2,000 people if it's just proportionate to GDP. And so,
5 minutes left.
Excuse me?
Just 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So we can imagine we're getting to the place where, you know, we might start having branching off in as such. Now, what are the natural borderlines that we can imagine? Well, on Mars, we actually do have recognized zones. We have names for them, but let me suggest that this is not a good basis for countries. And the reason for that is because, can you see my cursor here? The Olympus Mons, these three here, and you've got Valles Marineris. You've got a whole bunch of wealthy things. If volcanoes and whatnot, if this provides some resources, well, neighboring countries around that are not going to have those resources. So my feeling is this is probably not the best way to divide people, but rather perhaps if something about Hellas Basin being low altitude is good, well, these 4 countries here would have access to this. These 4 countries would have access here. Multiple countries would have access to these volcano areas, and multiple countries would also have access to the higher latitudes and the water that is there. So I'm, who knows what the border is going to be like, but I'm suggesting that we draw the borders early. Now, how do we do that? My suggestion is probably the United Nations and COPUOS is just takes too long and has too much agreement, really hard to do it, to even propose. So my suggestion is basically, draw a line in the sand. Have a group of people, scientists, representatives from different parts of the world, people who are on board. They're the coalition of the willing. They're people who say, this is a good vision, and amongst themselves, as a private group, what they do is they define what are reasonable borders that they can agree upon, and they put it out there as, hey, we think that these borders would be best. Then in the future, as things start developing, there'll be a reference point that hopefully people will turn to and say, hey, long ago there was these borders that were suggested, why don't we adopt them? So if there's questions in the chat, I'd be glad to handle those.
Great, thank you very much, Doug. Yeah, there are quite a lot of questions and we got 3 minutes, so I'll take the first one. And Simon Hill says, I suspect the nature of governance on Mars will, as Doug points out, change over time. A lot will depend on the first few years, who or what organization goes there. Does SpaceX have any policies on governments in a Martian colony? And could there also be the equivalent of the Moon Treaty / Artemis Accords produced for Mars?
Great question. Now, Elon has suggested he thinks direct democracy is a good way to go on Mars, but I personally doubt that SpaceX or Elon is going to dictate. In the Starlink contract, SpaceX said people who signed the contract agreed that Mars will be developed according to the good faith agreement between those who go. And I suspect that's how it's going to be. I'm just suggesting that the people who go over time are going to want to live in their own people groups.
Thank you. Thomas Schaefer asks, what about economic competition policies? Wouldn't trade be a relevant topic on Mars itself and trade relationships between Mars and Earth?
Yeah, I think Mars can have a trading relationship that could have tariffs, but I really think there needs to be a free trade, especially on the Moon because of limited resources, but also on Mars. I just don't see the need to start developing those, competitive. How can I say? There will be competition, but the conflict of trade barriers.
John Ratliff asks, what about a universal language developing?
I think probably the only way to do that, the universal language is probably going to be English for practical reasons, but English is not the ideal off-Earth language. I just don't think people are going with Esperanto, and is somebody going to come up with a new one? I don't know that people are going to adopt it. And if older people are overrepresented, they're going to have a hard time learning a new language. Technology could conceivably get past that, but I think that's speculative at this point.
Okay, so we've got a 3-part question from Pavel. So Pavel asks, what political system you think will be optimal choice for first city? How do you think should we start experiments on this topic now on Earth when group of people will be simulate society which live driven by different political systems? And what do you think about crypto anarchism as direct democracy system?
Fascinating. I'm going to have to plead ignorance here. Besides democracy, and frankly, the way the United States is going right now, I wonder if there's a better way than the form of democracy that we have. But you have to let people have a choice. But there needs to be systems in which people can move things forward. I am not so into politics that I have a definite idea of what that might be. But the cool thing is people will be able to experiment, and those that work, people will want to go to it, and so it will win out in the marketplace of ideas. Crypto, that's great. I mean, not just crypto, but the blockchain technology, I think could be used for governance.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're just out of time now, so thank you very much, Doug, for your talk.
Thank you.
Nice cat.
Yes.
The recording will be available on YouTube. There's a Slack channel, by the way. There are a few other questions in the chat, so I can leave the Zoom call open for a little bit if you'd like to arrange.
Yeah, let me see if I can go through. Let's see if I can.
There was a long one from Rob that I didn't get to.
Okay. Okay. Bob, Dick, about why not just Mars as one country? I mean, you could have a federal system, but again, you need to allow people to govern themselves by the divisions that they want to do, by their own people groups. Okay, let's see. Game of Thrones, recent history. We don't want conflicts. We don't want. I love this. We don't want conflicts like that on a planet with no breathable atmosphere. You are absolutely right, and that's why I think we need to draw borders before they are needed. What political, okay, crypto anarchism. I just don't know enough about that. Okay, change over time. I think trade between Mars and Earth, it's going to be quite limited. I mean, except for intellectual property. But I think the economics is going to be driven by the wealth that people bring to it. Think about active retirement communities, how they don't do IP, they don't mine, they don't do reality TV shows, and yet they prosper. It's because people have made wealth at different places in different times, different markets, and they bring it. They're going to bring that to the moon and to Mars. 3 new messages. Thank you for your answer. Thanks, Thomas. All children on Mars must learn a simple common language, perhaps in addition to parent language. I would support that. I think that's an excellent idea, Bruce. Might conflicts lessen conflicts later? Yes, because at least you have the language in common. And just for trade and for travel around, I think a second common language would be great. Bruce or anybody, could you suggest what that language would be? I think that is it. Okay, thank you.